of Operation Desert Storm, the war in the Persian Gulf, continues with a special edition of Good Morning America.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Charles Gibson.
And I'm Joan Lennon. It is Thursday, January the 17th, and throughout this morning we will bring you a special edition of Good Morning America.
The war against Iraq is now 12 hours old, and preliminary indications are that the massive air attacks against sites in Iraq and Kuwait going well. Encouraging was the word last night from the Defense Secretary, Dick Cheney, but still exact details of the way things have gone have been sketchy. The details about the effectiveness of the attacks on Iraq and Kuwait, the word on casualties, the pictures of the operation slow in coming in. So all morning long, we will be going to Peter Jennings in the newsroom for updates on the situation and how things are going. This is really the first war to begin, I guess, on live television. And the coverage is going to continue that way. In this hour, we will be talking to a couple of military analysts to try to get a line on how things have gone through the night and into the day, Middle Eastern time. We'll get a rundown on that and how things may go in the next few days.
Also, Marvin Zonas, a Middle East analyst, will help us understand how all of this might affect the Arab world, the Arab alliance. But now, for the latest on events in Operation Desert Storm, we go to Peter Jennings.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Charles. It's going to take a while, but Charles, I think you put your finger on it right away. We begin with cautious but not altogether well-informed optimism. So as you listen to us this morning and as you listen to our various commentators, bear in mind that it is almost 7 hours since the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the President spoke to the nation. And they were very cautious at the time, saying they believed at the time that all had gone pretty well, appears to have gone well, were the actual words of the Secretary of Defense. The Iraqi response in almost all instances appears to have been limited. The element of surprise, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs said to have been considerable. One of the reasons for that may well have been the surprise technological capability of the cruise missiles, which were launched against many Iraqi air defense sites from battleships in the Persian Gulf, which appear on the surface to have done their job. But the Middle East this morning is in some considerable turmoil as we sit back and try to assess the morning after, or in the case of Baghdad, the afternoon after, because it is now 2 minutes after 3 in the afternoon in Baghdad. Baghdad has begun to emerge to discover that the capital city itself has been hit, and some of the targets which were very high on the list of American priorities have indeed been hit, though we do not yet know how badly they have been damaged. There is a piece of wire copy out of Nicosia, the island of Cyprus, just a few miles off the Mediterranean coast in the eastern Mediterranean this morning, that says that President Saddam Hussein has been out and around in Baghdad this morning, having toured the streets, gone off to see Air Force and Defense headquarters in Baghdad. We cannot confirm that, but as soon as we can, we will talk again to ABC's Gary Sheppard, who is in Baghdad. We'll also talk to a lot of the other Arab capitals and, of course, talk to official Washington this morning that watches all this with the eye of a hawk. It does appear that in terms of the military campaign, the initial air phase continues in a very vigorous way. ABC's Jim Hickey reports from down in the Gulf that the second wave of air assaults has begun, and a short while ago he filed this report on pilots who had come back from their first missions.
The power was awesome. In fact, one commander at this Persian Gulf air base called it the most powerful air armada that has ever been formed. At precisely 1:26 in the morning, 5:26 in New York, the Air Force 35th Tactical Fighter Wing launched the attack. First up, more than a dozen F-4 Wild Weasels. They went after Iraqi surface-to-air SAM missile sites. Leading them all, Squadron Leader Lieutenant Colonel George Walton from San Antonio, Texas.
Well, the biggest thing I saw was one of the most fantastic fireworks demonstrations I've seen since 4th of July party years and years and years ago. This was tremendous. Baghdad was lit up like a Christmas tree.
With their afterburners glowing hot in the dark, the jets quickly disappeared in the clear, cool, and very dark night. No moon, perfect for an air assault. As some of the Wild Weasels headed straight to Baghdad, FA-18s from the 3rd Marine Air Wing roared to the skies. Wave after wave of aircraft took off, including A-6 intruders and radar-jamming electronic warfare planes. Officials here say the first missiles hit Baghdad at 3 a.m., 7 p.m. in New York, on time and on target. Military commanders fully expected Iraqi retaliation on this airbase. In fact, there were 2 air raid alerts during the night. Iraqi missiles apparently were detected headed in this direction, but local officials said they fell short. This is Jim Hickey with the television pool at an airbase in the Persian Gulf.
There continues to be overnight enormous confusion about the capacity of Iraqi long-range missiles, namely the Scud, Soviet-built and upgraded by the Iraqis in some cases. There were all sorts of reports early in the evening last night that they had been launched. The Secretary of Defense in his briefing last night said that was not the case, but that is a briefing of some 7 hours ago. ABC's Bill Redeker in Saudi Arabia, who endured a couple of air raid warnings while he was on the air, said the Marines believed that Scuds had been launched, and so did the Minister of Civil Aviation in Bahrain, that small island just off the coast of eastern Saudi Arabia, so that remains some measure of confusion. We do know from Israeli intelligence that very early in the campaign, if we can go to the general map of Iraq and Israel here, that 2 of the missile sites in the western frontier, it's a map up there on the wall over there if you're looking for it on the left, that 2 of the missile sites on the western frontier of Iraq, where it meets Syria there, in the left-hand corner of your screen, were suppressed very quickly by the Allied air attacks, and very shortly the Israelis began to relax. Now, all, of course, that happened at night. The Iraqi Air Force has a very limited capability at night. The Iraqis clearly were caught off surprise in the view of virtually every analyst we talked to last night, and daytime brings something of another situation, but there has been no evidence that we have been able to find that the Iraqis have managed to get one of their long-range Scuds up and going. Allied radar, American, Israeli, Saudi Arabia, not to mention the great AWAC planes out over the Saudi desert, are able to detect the Scuds going up, and they take 40 minutes, some cases 2 hours, to get them up and fully fueled, so it's not as if they are able to mount a complete surprise. But as we said, the second wave of attacks on Iraqi targets throughout Iraq, on all kinds of installations, and on Kuwait, is now well underway. A short while ago, Gary Sheppard, who endured, along with other Western reporters, a long and very difficult night in Baghdad, filed this report on a little bit of what it was after first light.
This is Gary Sheppard, ABC News, Baghdad. There was more anti-aircraft fire again here this morning. The sound of explosions in the distance. We're not sure whether it was another Allied air raid against Baghdad or just some sort of practice defense by the Iraqi army. It only lasted a short time, perhaps 30 or 40 seconds, and then later on another similar round, anti-aircraft fire, and the sounds of explosions again. Last night, the main Allied attack lasted for 3 hours. It began at about 2:40 in the morning. Massive display of anti-aircraft fire in the skies, the sounds of explosions, and from our vantage point at the Al Rashid Hotel, we could see a number of explosions on the horizon. This morning, as you drive around Baghdad, there is some evidence of the damage. The main international communications center has been heavily damaged and is no longer functioning, so normal telephone calls cannot leave Baghdad. There are people on the streets. There seems to be a shortage of taxis and other vehicles. A lot of people trying to get out of town and unable to. But the city has not been demolished. The precision bombing by the American planes intended to take out specific targets and left the vast majority of the city intact. Foreign journalists here at the Al Rashid Hotel, many of them trying to leave the city now. A small contingent apparently planning to stay here and see what happens. Radio Baghdad this morning broadcast a statement by Saddam Hussein saying to the effect that the war has just begun. This is Gary Sheppard, ABC News, Baghdad.
If we can stay with that map of Baghdad for a second, we can perhaps elaborate a little further. The Ministry of Defense there in the upper portion of the picture is actually on the right-hand bank of the Tigris River, which makes its way right through the center of Baghdad. That appears to have been the only target on the much more civilian crowded side of the city that has been hit. Iraqi radio and television down there on the left bank has not been hit, but all of the prime targets, like the new presidential palace, parts of the foreign ministry, parts of the information ministry, which is just though not marked there, just to the right of the Al Rashid Hotel, are all on a much less populated side of the Tigris River. And of course, many of the targets that U.S. fighter bombers were after, as Gary Sheppard reported last night, were farther to the west on that map, farther to the left off the screen, out on the ring of anti-aircraft and SAM, strategic surface-to-air missile defense installations, which were set up in an enormous ring around the city and around the international airport to defend against just this sort of Allied bombing attack. And as best we can tell, much of it appears to have been suppressed. It is always the priority of the mission to get, first of all, the radar systems down, and then anything that can take on your Air Force. There's been one mention already of the Iraqi Air Force. One American pilot returning from a mission in the Gulf said, as far as he could tell, some of the pilots had turned and gone north. That would be up to northern Iraq, at least towards the Turkish border. There's no indication yet of what that means, whether Iraqi pilots simply decided not to engage. But now, based on such little information, there is no indication yet that the Iraqi and American Air Force, or for that matter the British, or the French, or Saudi Arabian, or Kuwait Air Force, were engaged in the air-to-air action. Let's go to eastern Saudi Arabia, where Bill Redeker is standing by. Bill, what's new?
Peter, we can actually add to that report that you just filed. A U.S. F-15 fighter pilot here in our area tells us that he, in fact, shot down a Iraqi warplane over the skies outside of Baghdad earlier today. The Air Force captain is Steve Tate from Michigan. He says that he hit the plane with one Sparrow air-to-air missile. It blew up in a tremendous fireball, fell to the ground, and shattered into 1,000 pieces. And he was the leader of a flight of 4 F-15s. That's the normal configuration in which they've been departing the airfield here. It has been a very busy and noisy morning and afternoon. We've had British and Saudi fighter planes departing from one end of the airbase and American F-15s departing from the other end. Obviously, the Air Force is keeping its pledge to mount a punishing and continuing campaign of airstrikes. Thought we'd show you a copy of today's Arab News. This is a Xerox copy because it is actually not even published yet. The publisher faxed this over to us. It's an extra edition that they're putting out. The press obviously getting behind the effort here, though the copy is fairly straightforward and not full of all that much prose, really.
Bill, let me ask you about that air-to-air encounter. Was that by day or by night, do you know?
That was earlier this morning, so it would have been in a nighttime environment, in other words, dark, but it was actually earlier today, Thursday, our time.
It is now 2:13 in the afternoon in Tehran, and as you know better than most of us, the Saudis, the Iraqis, have considerably more capability by day than they do by night. Is there any indication there? Does anybody anticipate that the Iraqi Air Force is yet going to be seen?
I'm sorry, could you repeat it one more time?
No, my fault perhaps. Is there any anticipation where you are in eastern Saudi Arabia from American military that the Iraqi Air Force is going to yet be seen?
Not much. We heard the same report that you referred to earlier, and that came from another pilot here that the Iraqi jets took off and headed north towards the Turkish border. And there are several other reports that the Air Force has been decimated. It's been very difficult to get hard information from the Air Force or from the Central Command in Riyadh. We've played several calls today. They have buttoned up. They won't give us any details. I suspect those sort of details will come out of Washington a little later this morning, your time. One thing to note, a lot of news agencies from other foreign capitals are starting to report casualties to the multinational air power forces. But we cannot at this point confirm them, and indeed many people have suggested that it may have been, at least for the Americans, a casualty-free campaign.
Okay, Bill, just to interject for a second to tell people that while the French are among those who have been reporting that at least 4 of their aircraft were hit during their attacks on Iraq or Kuwait over the night, and one of their pilots was wounded. Much of what you hear this morning should be taken with a grain of salt. I'm not necessarily doubting what we hear from the Allied side, just pointing out that from the coalition, not much has been heard in any official way. There's going to be a briefing in Riyadh, the Saudi winter capital, in about 15 minutes from now. The Iranians, for example, already have said that one U.S. fighter has been knocked down and the pilot captured. But Baghdad radio claims that 14 American aircraft were shot down. The thing to bear in mind that in the middle of a war like this, that particular kind of broadcasting or whatever appears in the press at this moment is as much for the morale on the home front as it is necessarily to sustain the truth. But bear in mind that this was a very crowded and very complex and very intense overnight campaign. If we take a look again at the map, you'll get some sense. You may have seen this before, but as most of us are just getting up, you may not have seen it all. How many targets, and that's just a small collection of them all over Iraq. Missile sites and military airfields, military command centers, including in Baghdad, rail lines and highways, chemical and nuclear weapon complexes, all of which the president referred to, even water purification plants, not to mention the political targets such as the presidential compound in Baghdad. And one of the aims here has been to isolate the Iraqi soldiers in the field, to cut them off from their political and their military high command. President Saddam Hussein himself has assumed yesterday a command of all forces, whatever that may mean. But part of the Allied strategy here is to isolate particularly the many hundreds of thousands of Iraqi soldiers who are heavily defended and dug into those defensive positions in Kuwait. But as of now, all of the action has been in the air and all of the services have been deployed. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell, last night made that very clear, which would indicate that not only did the Navy fly out of the Persian Gulf, but off carriers in the Red Sea, but even the Army, with some of their attack helicopters up along the Kuwaiti coast, may have been involved in the first assaults. Weather is crucial to all this, and I know that thanks to Good Morning America, Spencer Christian, as always, is standing by. Spencer, if you can hear me, give us a very brief update, will you, on what the weather is in the Gulf this morning.
Well, Peter, the weather was rather rainy last night throughout the Gulf region, all across the northern portion of Saudi Arabia and into much of Iraq and Kuwait as well. Of course, I'm no military expert, but the military experts do say under those conditions, the Allied forces had their best chance of achieving their mission, so they had the kind of weather they'd hoped for, cloudy and rainy. This afternoon, as it is afternoon there now, skies have cleared. There are just a few clouds remaining. It is a very calm, weather-wise, spring-like day almost, with sunny skies and temperatures ranging anywhere from the mid to upper 60s into the low to mid 70s. More clouds are expected to move into the region tonight, again covering northern Saudi Arabia. This is a satellite view of the movement of weather systems in the last 18 to 24 hours. This is the system that moved through last night, providing weather cover over much of the region. Today, skies are clear. Tonight, this system you see right here will be pushing eastward across northern Saudi Arabia into Iraq, and more rainfall is expected tonight, though it should be lighter than it was last night.
I knew I could count on you, but not to be that extensive. That's wonderful. Spencer Christian, thank you very much on the kind of weather forecast they don't normally get in the Persian Gulf itself. President Bush has been up for some time now, at least a couple of hours. Let's go to the White House to ABC's Ann Compton. Ann?
I tell you, Peter, he is clearly energized this morning. It is dawn here, 12 hours after the initial launch of the attack. But the president says he has been up for hours before dawn. He poked his head into the press room here about 6:30 in the morning, and he said that he had been in the Oval Office. He was dressed casually. He had been back and forth, but he's back now in formal dress, expected to meet within the next few minutes with his top national security team, including Secretary Cheney and General Powell. The president expressed some satisfaction that things were going according to plan, just as the media was reporting. In his address last evening, the president made it very clear that he had clearly outlined to the media, or to the military, exactly what he wanted those targets to be in Iraq. He said all of his targets are military ones.
Annie,
we are determined to knock out Saddam Hussein's nuclear bomb potential. We will also destroy his chemical weapons facilities. Much of Saddam's artillery and tanks will be destroyed. Our operations are designed to best protect the lives of all the coalition forces by targeting Saddam's vast military arsenal.
This morning, Peter, there are, of course, several questions left unanswered. The president did not address the issue of casualties. Clearly, he's been given some update from the Gulf. He also has not said what is the current status and the future of the ground forces, the hundreds of thousands of American troops on the ground not involved in the air war. Peter?
Are we going to see him today, do you think, Ann?
I'll bet a week's salary on it, Peter, and I expect we'll see him early. The president feels at this moment he has a tremendous amount of support from the American people, from the leaders of Congress. He has been getting calls from foreign leaders who clearly support what he has done so far, and he intends to capitalize on that. He is not one to sit in the background when something like this is going on.
Okay, because as so many people have pointed out, thanks Ann Compton of the White House, this is an action unlike any other, which is clearly going to define his presidency. If it goes well, it's wonderful for his presidency. We'll mark him as a man who has benefited tremendously from history. If it doesn't go well, the political costs may be extremely high. On this question of casualties, the Secretary of Defense was very careful last night at his one and only briefing we have had so far not to say there had been no casualties, but that he did not wish to commit himself on the subject of casualties just yet. We may get some of that from the American High Command briefing in the Saudi Arabian capital, Riyadh, in a short while from now. ABC's Barry Dunsmore is on the line from Riyadh. Barry, several hours since we've spoken to you. Bring us up to date on what you think's going on.
Well, Peter, we've had a rather quiet night after the original two alarms that we dealt with here, and the possibility that there were Scud missiles coming in our direction. As you know, this was supposed to be the point at which information was to be disseminated to the international news media, but that has not been the case during the night. There was a briefing that had been set up with a Saudi Arabian general, which was first postponed and then apparently canceled. We do, however, expect to be briefed in a matter of minutes now by an American Air Force Lieutenant Colonel who is to give us an update on the air war, and one hopes that at that point we shall get some hard information. I did notice a report just passing my desk here a moment ago that one U.S. F-15 fighter claims to have shot down an Iraqi warplane in the skies over Baghdad. That's apparently the first enemy kill of the Allied attack. There's not a time on that, so I'm not absolutely certain as to how old that report is, but it's the first that I have seen of the Iraqi Air Force being in direct combat with the Allied forces.
Yes, it's fairly fresh, Barry. In fact, Bill Redeker in eastern Saudi Arabia mentioned it just a short while ago, but you're quite right. It is the one and only report we have so far of American and Iraqi pilots having engaged one another. Last night, you were very constrained there by the threat of a possible chemical attack on the Saudi capital. Have you had a chance to get out and look in the streets today to see how Saudis are reacting?
Well, yes, things are actually quite normal here. There seems to be almost the normal amount of traffic. People have come to work. People have come to work here in the hotel. They've even got room service going reasonably well. And the American embassy put out the word that Americans and other foreigners ought to be cautious and careful about their movements. But as far as I know, there haven't been any incidents on the street at all. This is a place, this is a capital that is very carefully controlled by the security forces, and one has to bear that in mind as well. But things do appear to be normal on the street.
Okay, Barry, thanks very much. We'll come back to you for the briefing when the Air Force decides to give it. It is only about 12 hours and a half, 12 hours and 24 minutes by our reckoning, that we heard the first news that the attack on Baghdad had begun. I recall at that point that one of the very first things to happen was that oil prices skyrocketed. Oil prices have now come down. Both the oil market and the stock market are astonishingly volatile. They respond to rumor as much as anything. But given the general tenor of reporting over the last 12 hours, oil prices are down and the stock market in Tokyo is up. In fact, the market in Tokyo posted its 10th highest gain. We're also told from overseas that if things continue to go as well as they have on the Paris stock market, the Bourse in Paris, then it may turn out to be its biggest one-day gain. All of that based on the rumors of war. So let us go back now to Charlie Gibson and Joan London for a while.
That's Charlie.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's 25 minutes after the hour, and someone was just talking in my ear as you threw to me. Operation Desert Storm, as you were mentioning just a moment ago, has been underway for just over 12 hours now, and the United States and Iraq seem to be offering somewhat different accounts of the fighting. Iraqi radio, in reports that you described as being rather suspect so far, are talking about downing a number of American planes, but we have no word on casualties that can be considered reliable so far. Joining us to try to clear away some of the fog of war is retired Army Colonel William Taylor, a military analyst at Georgetown University, who is joining us this morning from Los Angeles. And it's good to see you again, Colonel Taylor. Yesterday morning, when we were talking, you said that you had at first not believed that air power in this conflict could be decisive, that you had changed your mind some. How do you read what's happened so far?
Well, from the initial reports, and we have to wait now for a little while, we're only about 12 hours into this, our Air Force has been extremely effective. We must have learned a lot of lessons since our attempts to strike a few years ago in another country, you'll recall. But the bombing, the missiles have been very, very precise. But we're only a few hours into it. We have to wait and see. We don't know anything about our own casualties. Evidently, they're low, but there are going to be casualties on our own side, the multinational force side. We just have to be a little careful about the early assessment on whether or not air power is decisive.
Well, you inject a good sense of caution. There had been so much anticipation of all of this that when the early reports were encouraging, I suspect there is a tendency in people's minds to jump ahead and say, well, we seem to be in very good shape here. But it does appear, you can go this far as to say that we obviously have established very quickly superiority in the air. I have heard quotes from some pilots saying the skies are ours.
Yeah, I'm hearing the same thing, and that means that our early suppression of those first fighters that went in, of their radars, of their command and communication centers has been done very, very well. But we're not going to be able to put as many sorties per day in the air attacking targets as we've been able to do in the first 12 hours. Planes have to have a lot of maintenance, crews have to get a little bit of rest, so we're getting an early surge of surgical strikes. They look like they're going very well. We've got a while to go.
Are you surprised by the response? The pilots have not talked about any significant air opposition, that the Iraqis were not able to launch many aircraft against the United Nations forces as they came in. There is one report of a kill by a U.S. plane, of an Iraqi plane, but there does not seem to have been much air opposition. That opposition that was faced was basically from ground anti-aircraft. Are you surprised that the Iraqis didn't get up many planes against us?
I am. I think there was a lot of surprise involved in the whole attack. I think our information control was excellent. We didn't give away any information in advance. I think we caught them with our pants down, quite frankly.
All right, Colonel Taylor, thank you for joining us again this morning. We're going to take a break, and in a few moments, Good Morning America will continue.